I want to give a philosophical talk on the ancient world. Um, Ancient history is something that interested me a lot, and over the past few years, I speed listened to a lot of text and delivered some of my philosophical theories to other audiences, but it ended up causing quite a lot of upset, and I thought, well, if it's such an upsetting theory, I should just put it out there for other people to read and comment on. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? So anyway, my philosophical hunch or whatever, like my thought system, kind of began in childhood when I was really fascinated by the fact that Jesus didn't write anything, even though he seemingly had the capacity to. At one point, Jesus wrote on the ground and was definitely trained by others, and I think he could have definitely um, made things more clear if he had actually written what his beliefs were in some kind of code form, but he didn't do that. Um, Buddha also was another person that was like a moral exemplar that people imitated and emulated, and he also, interestingly enough, didn't write anything. So I would lump these two people together as super influential figures that are center of religions with tragic components to their character, and I would try to consider what these characters had in common, Buddha and Jesus respectively. I was also aware of tvtropes.com as a high schooler and was pretty interested in the concept of a trope in general. So I would think how I could tropify Jesus and Socrates as characters and what they have in common, since that just seemed like the natural thing to do when considering tropes. Socrates, on the other hand, was another character who is also tragic, just like Jesus, and similarly executed, also for being a kind of revolutionary. We really know that the ancient Romans typically reserved the punishment of crucifixion for revolutionaries, and similarly, Socrates was put to death for both being a corrupter of youth and being a revolutionary character. So that was also something that he had in common. But also, these three figures that I've already mentioned here, now Jesus, Buddha, and Socrates, also didn't write anything. So that's another common characteristic that these three non-writer characters all had in common as the trope I started to slowly build in my mind as I was developing as a young person. If you think about Socrates, a lot of what made Socrates attractive in the first place was that he didn't write anything. So there are quotes lying around like, Socrates was enigmatic because he wrote nothing. And that seemed pretty interesting to me. Why would somebody be more enigmatic because they don't write anything? And what makes somebody more worthy of being um, interesting when because they don't write anything? To me, um, it's if you have the capacity to write something and you don't write something, you're leaving your followers worse off because you're creating a lack of clarity by the absence of the writing you could have written. Moses also was a person that, like the other three, was trained by elite people. So he was, trained by the Egyptian elite, and presumably would have had the capacity to read maybe hieroglyphs or what have you, and write. But he also didn't write anything, and he also had a tragic side of his character too, in the sense that he, never made it to the promised land. So that's interesting to me. I started to slowly build this this trope of the non-writer, this trope of the moral exemplar, and wonder about that in the back of my mind. It wasn't until later on that I realized that we actually have no physical writings from Aristotle. So Cicero once remarked on Aristotle that if Plato's prose was silver, Aristotle's was a flowing river of gold. And that's a pretty weird statement for him to make, considering we don't have any of this golden prose from Aristotle. All we really have is the compiled notebooks of his disciples, which were poorly written according to what Norbert Wiener's comments were about those, and just sanctified by philosophers over time as being of high quality, when apparently they are not to some people. So that rang a bell. It seemed pretty familiar. Like, okay, so Aristotle didn't leave any physical writings behind. Oof, that's weird. And Jesus didn't leave any physical writings behind. Oof, okay. So those two figures also had disciples that were able to write, although it was, in the case of Jesus, it was years after his death. And unfortunately, a lot of what we have about, I guess, like the resurrection and other details of Jesus' life were not consistent between the authors. So that seemed like a pretty mysterious flag, if you will. So it also seemed like a potential point for investigation. So if we try to prove things scientifically or understand the world or want to understand the world scientifically, typically we want to perform experiments where we can achieve the same result many times. And that's something that it seems that analysts of ancient philosophy and religion lacked when it came to the ancients, because those ancient figures might have been miracle workers or were enigmatic because they didn't write anything. Well, if you put bricks into the water, like a pile of bricks into the water, 10 times, over time that, hey, if I put bricks into the water 10 times, it's going to float. It's going to sink. It's going to sink. So we know that we know that through scientific testing that if you do this, this happens. If you do this, this happens. And that's science. Well, I believe that over time, people knew or became aware of certain features of the human mind and certain susceptibilities and vulnerabilities of the human mind too. And they were able to develop schemes like talking about a figure that doesn't write anything to generate interest in a crowd in order to create schools or interests or institutions or what have you. And they were able to do this by creating a kind of hook, if you will, by talking about this moral authority figure who didn't write anything, who's really mysterious, who is really tragic, because those are emotional hooks that can be used to seduce you as a listener into taking an interest in this story. So I think that this idea has like some legitimacy too, because I realized that talking about a figure that doesn't write anything has defensive and offensive function. So one of the philosophers that I read at one point was Leostrauss, and Leostrauss believed that the ancients wrote exoterically in order to avoid persecution. So that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people were executed back in the day. They had their tongues ripped out and were crucified or burned alive or whatever. Some really horrible, painful punishments that would warrant writing in a way that was defensive, self-defensive, or even offensive, depending on what kind of person you are. And so what the word exoteric might mean is that, like, okay, so if you think of the exoskeleton of a shell, creature like a crab or monster or something, there's like this exoskeleton, and then there's a soft, cushy interior, which is the true meaning of the text. So Strauss would believe that even if you had the original text, you would be reading it and you wouldn't really understand its real function or what it's really about. You would instead kind of just be like, oh, I think I know what this means. So Strauss would invite the reader to read between the lines of the ancient writings. So when I would, read the ancient writings, I would sometimes do that. Although I wouldn't consider myself a Straussian per se, because while Strauss did give this to us as a reading recommendation, he didn't really explain what these elite interpretations might be. But I think I'm going to do that here. So yeah, here goes. So what could be the rhetorical function of talking about a person that doesn't write anything? I wondered. I realized that if I talk about a person that doesn't write something, I can invite the listener to fill in the blank of what that person would have written if only they had. So I can go to a crowd of students and say, hey, Socrates, who was really enigmatic because he didn't write anything, was this really smart person, super reasonable, and he thought this, that, and the other thing. What do you think of this dialogue that Plato wrote about Aristotle? And then people can go, wow, gee, it sure would have been nice if Socrates had written their ideas. And I am sure curious about this writing you have. I think I'm going to write my own writing on what Socrates would have thought, or whether Socrates' argument is valid or invalid, or true or false. And in doing that, I can get the listener to start to scribble away, trying to figure out the enigma of the non-writer figure. And I feel like this is an advantage because it lets you generate interest and it lets you consume economic resources just by implanting the seed of interest in a subject. So that's one function that I would say is offensive because it lets you acquire human beings and potentially economic resources using just your speech. A defensive function of talking about a person that doesn't write anything is if you were to start a defensive function could be, well, I'm in this scenario. Somebody has me in custody. They have my text as well. The text is a dialogue. It's not me. I didn't write. I am not the person with these views in this dialogue. This is Socrates and other people. Don't kill me. These are not my ideas. I'm just Plato. This is a dialogue. I remember that when I went to, I was friends with this Socrates person, and I recorded what they did in their life because they were just a really cool person to me. So please don't rip my tongue out or burn me alive. I'm just the person documenting the story. Okay, so that's an example of a defensive function of talking about a person that doesn't write anything. On the one hand, I can use them as a mouthpiece for my ideas, and on the other hand, I can say that mouthpiece is somebody else. So they become the fall guy, and conveniently in both the Socrates story and Jesus story respectively, that fall guy is killed. So they've already been punished. All I'm doing is talking about the punished person and writing about their life as the punished person, as almost another layer of self-defense to prevent me from becoming the punished. Because look guys, the punishment's been doubled. Don't punish me. So that's a defensive function. So I listed an offensive function and a defensive function. Another potential possible function of talking about a person that doesn't write anything would be that I have the exclusive access to the story of that non-writer. So I can centralize the power around me as the speaker of the non-writer. So nobody knew the non-writer better than I did. I was Socrates' closest friend. I was Jesus' disciple. I was Buddha's student. I was in Moses' tribe. In doing that, I can basically become the authority figure who knew these non-writer figures best. And because of that, I can say, look, you got to listen to me. The closest access you'll ever have to the non-writer is me. So listen to me and my authority. And that, in doing that, that gives you total access to the story of the non-writer and gives you this privilege over others, I would say. And in my opinion, these are rhetorical functions, rhetorical strategies. And it's important to recognize in the ancient world that rhetoric was recognized as a very important thing. The elites would typically train their students in the science of rhetoric and the science of persuasion, and that makes a lot of sense. Like in the modern world, if you write a contract proposal and you write it in a poor way, you might not get that grant money. And it's the same in the ancient world. If you don't persuade such and such or that crowd to do X, Y, Z, then you will be out of, you will become the slave as opposed to the commander. which would be, not desirable in that ancient world. So rhetoric became this super important thing, and it only makes sense to look at the non-writer figures through this lens of rhetorical functional analysis that I have here. And I think that's a really big deal that we do that, because it lets us strip the ancient world of its spirituality and hopefully make the world a more unified place, because we can dispense with the conflict between the religions and focus on what we all have in common as life forms. When we look at things scientifically, do bricks float or do they sink? To test that, we just have to put bricks in the water over and over again and verify that those bricks do indeed sink for such and such reason. Miracles, on the other hand, are immune to this kind of testing because they are supernatural events. And these supernatural events, by the way, can be used as emotional hooks to unsuspecting victims of these rhetorical techniques and strategies. So I would say that if we want to really understand ancient history, what we need to do is analyze it in a way that looks for these commonalities and the benefits and the rewards one can get from doing these things. So, for example, why did the vocal cords evolve in a way that makes me more susceptible to choking? Well, if myself as a biological life form is so better off by my ability to manipulate people with my speech to survive, of course my genes are going to form me into a being where I keep doing that for my survival, and eventually my vocal cords will be quite good at manipulating and not so, maybe a little more vulnerable to choking to death is what I'm saying. So that's interesting. Why are people depressed? Well, if you're depressed, you become needier, and if you're needier, your needs might be met as an organism. So this way of analyzing the ancient philosophy and religions and their figures is on the one hand, it's like this rhetorical. I do this rhetorical analysis, and I also think of the biological and sociological advantages of looking at things this way. So if I were to back up and start with the tradition that was called Sophistry, Sophistry became pejorified really through Plato's use of the Socrates character. So Socrates would typically engage with a sophist, propounding a theory, and exhaust them in dialogue, and in doing so demonstrate that Socrates, who knows nothing and is more interested in these ideals like truth or goodness, showed the sophists what they really are. The sophists are just people who hunt people for money, talk to people for money. They don't know how to make people good in this hyper-idealistic sense that Socrates has in mind. They don't know what fundamental truth means. They can't get to the truth. They're just too pragmatic for Socrates's ideals. So they must be wrong and predatory beings that are only interested in talking to people for money. And that's how sophistry becomes this dirty word, this pejorified thing, through Plato's use of the Socrates character. In Plato's dialogue, the Sophist is described as an angler, a person focused on the art of acquiring human beings, a person that uses speech like a barb were deployed from a spear fisherman, where the breath that is ejected from the mouth of the person into the ears of the subject is used like a hook that draws the subject into you. So there's this talk about speaker, listener, predator, prey, hunter, hunted in these Platonic dialogues. And Plato uses this demonized version of sophistry, or the science of rhetoric, as a way to make philosophy seem superior. Now, functionally speaking, a philosopher today still talks to people for money and sells a story for money and is a professional storyteller. So they are indistinguishable from the sophist in the mercenary sense. Demonizing people for being mercenaries doesn't mean that you've overcome that practice. What Plato does is make the practice of philosophy seem superior by turning a recognizer of predatory speaking behavior into the mascot of philosophy, which I believe is just rebranded sophistry. So, ergo, Plato really uses Socrates as a character to pivot from sophistry to philosophy, as well as re-legitimize itself under a new title, philosophy, love of wisdom. So, wow, that's kind of interesting that Plato would do all of that. But again, it makes sense if he's trying to, defend himself as, wiser than thou. So there's also more to it. There's the Manichaean tradition. The Manichaean tradition had the practice of speaking and listening. So the speaker would be the tribe ruler, and the listener would be the subordinate subject. Similarly, with Christianity, there's the tongues of fire. Why tongues of fire? Well, the tongue is obviously this organ that you're using to persuade crowds to obey you or listen to you. So if Christianity is just the second edition of the human hunting art of being an angler of human beings, then what the Christians would be symbolizing with their symbolism would be this human fishing practice just hiding in plain sight, because we got these tongues of fire, which really only symbolize rhetorical ability. Jesus also straightforwardly says, hey, you guys want to become fishers of men? Which, chronologically speaking, means that Jesus could be delivering a proposition. Hey, do you want to join a human hunting practice where we use speech to target people for money? And that would mean that the ancient Christians would really just be sophists. And, again, using Jesus as their mascot, similar to how Plato used Socrates as his mascot. So Jesus becomes the tool that these sophists and philosophers and sages can use to pivot away, this time from philosophy and sophistry to Christianity, which is the second rebranding. There's some historical evidence of this in the writings of Lucian, who regards Jesus as a crucified sophist and sage. So that implies that at least some of the Roman upper class or whatever thought of Jesus as somebody that was both a sophist, as in like an expert rhetorician, and a sage, which is somebody that might either have rabbinical knowledge or be a you know, holy person, whatever. So yeah, that's pretty interesting to me. And it also, again, lets us look at these ancient figures in a more realistic way. I think we can even apply game theory to understanding, you know, what Jesus's statements meant. So, just like I said earlier, when I was like, if you hear Jesus's like statements, they don't sound like how a normal person talks. They're these like, it's like he's addressed by a crowd and he says this weird line that's supposed to be like this coup de grace, you know. But why? Why does he? What is the reason for this behavior? I think game theory and other ways of rhetorical, game theory can be used to analyze rhetorical function, I think. So if you think of, there's this cool example, I guess, in game theory of the cigarette pack company, where like two cigarette pack companies are competing for market advantage. Which one's going to have the highest? Which one's going to gain the most profits? Is it going to be the one that advertises or doesn't advertise? Well, the one that advertises is going to outdo their competitor. Similarly, if you like look at like Jesus's statements where he's like, guys, it's better to pray alone. Well, if you think of everything I've already talked about here, where using speech is super important for survival and biological function and saving calories and influencing others and having power and this and that, then Jesus' statement to pray alone would be the complete opposite of what you would want somebody to actually do. You would not want somebody to pray alone if you wanted them to be strong. You would want them to pray alone if you wanted them to be weak, because if they did that, they would be throwing their power to influence others away into an invisible authority figure in their minds. They would be hiding away in their apartment or whatever, praying to somebody in their head instead of going out into the street and telling everyone what they think is necessary to make the world a better place. So this prescription to pray alone, according to game theory even, tells us that this is just poison and we should not listen to that at all, and that it's bad. So in that way, I think it's more than possible that Jesus' sayings and so on actually represent what that actually represents as a toolkit, if you will, for these people studying the rhetorical arts to use to hunt for and acquire human beings in the ancient world. And that's pretty powerful if you think about it, because that means that I can use something that's immaterial, it costs me nothing to do or use my speech, and I can use that somehow to acquire a lot of stuff. So in Plato's dialogues, there's a lot of talk about the breath and things of that nature. Like Plato talks about how when he's talking about the Sophist again, and he's talking about their delivery system as a wind egg, some wind egg that can never arrive and materialize as physical reality. Nietzsche also does something like that too, where he talks about human beings as a genius of construction, forming a web of like a spider web of I forget the word he uses, but he basically says that like this web we use just really has to be effective enough at ensnaring other humans. It can be blown away by the wind. It doesn't matter. What the web of rhetoric is primarily useful for is influencing other humans, and that's it. So, which is what I imagine Nietzsche is getting at when it comes to his critique of knowledge and knowing and this and that, because he's also viewing things through this very philological lens. Can I say philology? Philology. It's a love of writing. So if I try to like trying to think of where I want to go here. So I said a lot. Right? I talk fast, right? Okay, so if I am trying to figure out what the rhetorical function is of talking about people that don't write anything, and I'm an ancient salesperson, basically, and I'm going into a crowd of people, and I'm going to like talk to them and try to get them to believe in my operation. Well, sorry. Yeah, this is how I wanted to do. I wanted to talk about I wanted to bring physics into this, okay? So I'm the organism, and I'm going to use speech against a crowd. Speech is immaterial. Speech is free. It doesn't cost anything. It's totally free. But if I convince that crowd to start using paper and ink in this to fill up this unfillable void of what the non-writers said or intended to say, then bam, I get them to start consuming physical goods. And if I get them to start consuming physical goods to fulfill my unfillable project, then I can start to take control of their entire economy, because paper is physical. Paper costs something. Ink is physical. Ink costs something. These are physical goods that, when consumed and utilized in the interest of understanding the endless void that I created as a rhetorician, that is this non-writer tragic figure, the game of filling in the unfillable becomes a trap where I damn the listeners to this endless task of completing what can never be completed, because I deliberately made it unable to be complete, because the non-writer never existed. It's just me talking to myself, working on rhetorical strategies for human beings to use to, like, I don't know, hunt people. So if that's what's going on in the ancient world, then that could be pretty useful, I would say. But that's also kind of like bad news in a sense for science, because that might mean that we'll never arrive at universal truth, because any expression of the universe in written form is not the universe at large, it's just written form. Actually, John von Neumann and others have arrived at the same conclusion about like trying to model the brain. Like, John von Neumann's like, it's possible that the model of the human brain would actually be too large to fit in the physical universe. Statements like that, where we try to model the universe through, just the project of trying to model the universe itself becomes a, second universe. So if that's not a valid project, what are we doing? Anyway, at the very least, though, I've tried to, explain the, how this form of, how this way of using speech to make yourself super powerful in the ancient world could have been like a way of life for people, and why there's evidence for that, and why it's consistent across time. Later on, there's the dialectical materialists, like Marx. So And these people were, students of, I guess, Hegel. Well, what's dialectical materialism? Can I talk about dialectical materialism based on everything I've already talked about here in a more straightforward way? I'm pretty sure I can, actually. So dialect would be speech, right? That's what I've been talking about this whole time. Speech, rhetoric, persuasion, etc. Materialism would be all the material in the world. So, rebar, bricks, paper, ink, cars, machines, clothes. That's material, right? So dialectical materialism would be a science that's interested in studying the human tendency in general to influence humans to do stuff with materials. And any philosophy that's interested in dialectical materialism, per se, would be interested in understanding sociologically how long this trend of interacting between, these, speakers and listeners and so on can go on until, and what will be achieved as a result. Well, communism is what Karl Marx has as like an end point, an end goal, a theoretical end goal in mind for where dialectical materialism could eventually lead. Now, I really don't think that Karl Marx was a really great person. He was known to be an alcoholic, an unstable individual. He was known to walk up to people and say, "I will annihilate you." So I actually suspect diabolical intent behind the writings of Marx, and anticipated that if I were to read Marx, I would find some poisoned pen in his writing, similar to Plato's exoterically self-defensive writings using Socrates as his mouthpiece. So in talking about dialectical materialism, what Marx might be interested in as a whole is how long this trend of humans influencing humans to do stuff with stuff can go on, and what will be the outcome of that. Now, what would communism even be? Would it be a state of total communication? Like, what would that mean? Would we be telepathically linked? Would we all share one mind, one community-ish-on? Like, what is the goal here? It can't be, unity and operational, like, inclusion. That would be a hive mind. So, like, we got to make sure, okay, that communism doesn't become another storytelling practice that is this the story of an eventual reality that can never arrive. So just like with all these examples I mentioned previously, we have to make sure that communism doesn't result in a storytelling practice of a future that never can materialize in the real world. But in fact, actually, I think that's exactly what communism does, and why communism always results in a totalitarian monologue of promising this eventual reality that can never arrive. That's another wind egg. So, what the dialectical materialists, e.g., communists, always ended up doing invariably in every case was they would talk about this communism, this state in the future, as something that could arrive in the future, and it would never come into existence, because fundamentally what it would degenerate into is a totalitarian monologue of describing this reality that can't ever come, because I'm never going to give the owners access to the means of production. What does that even mean? We seize the means of production. Who is we? What we are you referring to? So I like to use this example. So, like, let's say there's a hammer, and I pick it up. This is part of the means of production. It's in the workshop that we're trying to seize. Well, probably only one person can take hold of that hammer at once. If two people try to wield the hammer at once, what happens? Well, the hammer becomes inoperable. So we can't seize the means of production. That makes no sense. It makes no logistical sense. It's just stupid. It only makes sense in this diluted form of rhetorical inclusion where we hallucinate this imaginary seizure that can never arrive. It's, again, poisonous and just another way for a storyteller to make state functionaries the operational owners of the means of production rather than the original factory owners. So this is, I think, another plus of analyzing the ancient world through this lens of rhetorical analysis, because now we're able to get to a point where we can figure out whether stated political goals are materializable or not, whether they can actually be made manifest in the real world, or whether they're just, wind eggs that might never see the light of day, or won't ever see the light of day. So that's how, I don't know, there I think I've taken you from the ancient world, the modern world, even space, probably, because this situation of humans using speech to influence humans to do stuff with stuff and so on isn't going to go away until the human animal evolves out of this symbiotic relationship with itself and others or whatever. So I might pause and try to go back and talk about Plato's allegory of the cave for a little bit, even though it's not entirely related to all of this. But I did not make people happy in the past with my idea on how to understand Plato's allegory of the cave. But to me, it was really a no-brainer, because to me the allegory of the cave was an allegory for writing itself. So the allegory starts off by, there are these prisoners, they grew up in the cave since children, they have to speculate on the shadows, what the shadows really mean. Based on their success as identifiers of the shadows, they are given rewards and treats or whatever for their success as shadow speculators. And in this story, if somebody leaves the cave, they feel pain and rage because they've left the cave of writing. And then they see the real world. They see the world of the real outside the cave, and their eyes adjust to it. But something catastrophic happens, and if they try to go back into the cave to persuade the cave dwellers to leave the cave, they won't do it because A, they don't get these rewards. B, it makes the person that leaves the cave a little weaker, and it gives them power as well. And I think one of the clues we have I think it's pretty clear that Plato has to be talking about school. He's talking about the human tendency he's talking about the human tendency for behavior to condition the organism into being an organism that's really addicted and habituated and acclimatized to that particular kind of behavior. So the behavior this was reading and writing behavior, the shadow speculating behavior. The shadows would represent ink because the shadows are dark and ink is dark. The cave, the person who leaves the cave, there's this quote in the dialogue about the cave. Would he or she rather not wish for let me see here. Or would he rather not wish for what Homer speaks of, namely to live on the ground, live on the land above the ground, as the paid menial of another destitute peasant? Wouldn't he or she rather put up with anything rather than be that kind of human being? So in the dialogue, it's framed in a way where if the person leaves the cave, then they run the risk of becoming the paid menial of another destitute peasant, rather than somebody that's this property owner or shadow speculator. So I think that Plato is demonstrating some conscientiousness of several things here. So he has to be aware of that humans are malleable creatures. So Plato knew about like the story of Romulus and Remus, right? He knew that if you're raised by wolves, you'll act like a wolf. That means he knew that if you are raised reading and writing, you'll get addicted to reading and writing. If you're raised as a slave, you'll probably keep living your life as a slave or something like that. So Plato would be analyzing the human animal and sociologically and biologically here, and kind of wondering, okay, well, can we get the real nature of things if the person who leaves the cave of writing and discovers the real nature of things returns, and will the cave dwellers leave that cave or not? And he's saying, like, well, they won't, because right now in the ancient world, people are proving themselves in court as property owners and so on, because they have writing. So the primacy of speech is being like relocated to writing itself, this physical object that is capable of influencing other people. And basically, pretty much this what's happening here is Plato's going, okay, words aren't good enough anymore to prove that you own something or you agreed to this contract. It's writing. Writing is what's proving property ownership. So this situation of humans facing the real world will be, humans won't face the real world anymore. They'll start to face the cave wall more and more. They won't even want to leave the cave wall, because the cave wall is actually where the magic's happening. That's where we're able to speculate on what the shadows mean and use the shadows to influence human activity and control outcomes outside the cave. So if the cave wall represents writing, then you wouldn't want to leave the cave of writing, because that would mean that you might not become a property owner anymore. And you want to keep being a property owner in the ancient world, not be a slave. So the dialogue lets us believe. Well, that would be pretty disastrous to the modern philosopher's project if we were to accept that as the interpretation of the allegory of the cave. Because all modern philosophers are heavily engaged in the act of writing, which, per this interpretation of the cave, would never bring you into a fuller understanding of the real nature of things. Because you would keep trying to symbolize the unsymbolizable. You'd be trying to remodel the model, which, like I just tried to talk about with the John von Neumann thing, isn't something that you would be able to do. So, conveniently though, in this dialogue of the cave, there's also a persecution narrative, where the revealer of the cave is punished and killed, and turned into, so it's almost like Plato was prototyping like the death of the Socrates character in his dialogue in the Apology. And I think that what happened here is humans discovered that it's possible to like hook a crowd emotionally by getting them to speculate on the fate of this very influential, reasonable, good-hearted, kind person, and get you to care about their life to the degree that you become subservient to the storyteller of that person's life. So there we go. Yeah. I think that one other sign that this is like a hardening and improving of rhetorical strategy is that like Jesus' use of the word hypocrite, I think is potentially pretty useful. So like a hypocrite is somebody that doesn't do what they say. So, like, yeah, there's a lot of situations where leaders don't do what they say. They are, they're telling you about things, not doing what they say. They're instructing you how to do things, not doing what they say. So, Jesus' like favorite word, hypocrite, is to me like it's like a way to harden this old style of rhetorical attack where Socrates says that these people can't deliver these wind eggs. So I think that's how I would view Jesus and the Dark Ages and stuff that followed. By the way, none of this is really to say that Jesus wasn't a real person. I think he actually could have definitely been a real person, but I don't know. He also could have been manipulated a lot. He could have been trained to think that killing yourself was good, because like Lucian observed, there were a lot of losers back then that would kill themselves for attention or burn themselves alive for attention. And Jesus easily could have been one of those people that was groomed or manipulated or encouraged or persuaded to think that killing himself for attention in these ways was a good thing. So he still could have been this rhetorical device for social control. He still could have said these aphorisms, and that could have been true, and his crucifixion still could have been true. But at the same time, he also could have been groomed into thinking that was a good idea. And it might make a lot of people really mad to think that that's what happened, but you got to look backwards at the reality of what humans have done in the past and continue to do to this day. So, like in the ancient Aztec world, there was human sacrifice and auto-sacrifice and child sacrifice. Jesus is literally God's child, being killed for us, and basically, like, it's not wild to my imagination to like imagine that Jesus was like possibly groomed to sign up for crucifixion and so on. When the wise men introduced themselves to Mary and Joseph, we don't really know a lot about the wise men. Well, the wise men are this story sounds like a little bit like that transactional happening where, like, kids get offered up to human traffickers in exchange for money. So the wise men in this case would be potentially human traffickers grooming Jesus for this self-sacrifice so that he could become a rhetorical device for social control later. And yeah, if that's true, then that would be pretty messed up, because then from that point onwards, these rhetorical strategists would continue this practice of the human hunting art and carry that forward into the Dark Ages, where they normalized torture and this and that. And so yeah, and I think if you like look still at human beings to this day, we still haven't really stopped causing like bodily harm to kids and other people. Like this is still like an ongoing problem. Child abuse in the church could be explained not just as an accident, but something that's deeply a part of this the religious culture, where this outward veneer of goodness is a mask for depravity, and it even hides itself in plain sight by having this crucified divine child on a stick, or by having tongues of fire that are rhetorical ability, or having like the early Christians, one of them would draw an arch in the sand, and the other Christian, if they knew what that was signaling would draw the opposite end of the arch, and together these two arches would form the fish. And like I said before, there's a chronological connection between Plato and the Sophists' practice of human angling and fishing, and Jesus. So they're probably signaling, like, hey, you want to be a human hunter with me today? And in doing so, symbolize their membership there. So I'm happy that I've kind of put some of these ideas out there. I think this is good. This is good to share, and it can only mean good things to try to like really reveal what's really like kind of what the plight is for the human condition, and what humans have been dealing with for thousands of years, and maybe even for the foreseeable future. So I hope you've liked this talk and found it pretty interesting. I know a lot of what I'm delivering here is definitely new, but regardless, I hope you enjoyed it, and you're welcome to leave comments or what have you. Thank you.